One great example of that global competition, which is actually how we opened the book, is the story of Airbnb, which ended up having to blitzscale because the Somver brothers in Germany created a Airbnb clone and basically tried to hold them up. And there's a
Yeah,
great telling of the story in the book. And of course, there's also a happy ending because Airbnb won.
yeah,
But
exactly.
Airbnb is a fascinating one because this is another one of your legendary investments. What's interesting is you heard about the company from another investor when it was looking for its seed investments, but you didn't end up meeting with the company. And of course, you later led a round of investments, so happy ending. But can you talk about that story? What exactly happened? And then when you finally did meet with Airbnb, what were the factors that really attracted you to that deal?
So there's probably three parts to this. The first is um, a guy I know, great guy, just not necessarily particularly good, investment picker, described Airbnb to me, but he described it in ways that were bad, right? He basically was like, oh, this is how you can rent out your couch, right? And I went, oh, that's a terrible idea, right? Because even if you get every couch in the world, and this is kind of, again, thinking of blitzscaling, and maybe even if you have the network of, well, this is the place where you get couches, couches are by definition very low value items, right? Like it's kind of like, you would rather sleep on the couch than outdoors unless it's one of the campgrounds and everything else. And even then you might prefer the campground, but like if the couch is like, okay, will always be a super low value item, never has this kind of increasing values because part of what you want to get, just as like all businesses, you want to get to businesses that have good margin structures. And if you have a tiny price to divide up on couches, you're never going to get to an interesting margin structure, even if you're a pure software business, because you still, of course, have to acquire people, run the community, deal with problems, like all the problems where I knocked at the door and nobody was there and all the rest of the stuff. So I said, okay, that's a terrible idea. And so even though Brian, who is now, one of my close friends, one of the people I admire and I'm proud and honored to be working with in the world, didn't know him at the time, was like, I was just ignoring his emails because this person had come to me and had pitched it wrong. And the pitch, like I knew from my analysis that, well, that just as couches, a network of couches, even a network is zero interest, right? Like no interest. So then, maybe about a year later, a couple of other people, this gets to network intelligence, called me and said, look, Brian's amazing, right? And his co-founders, Nate and Joe, they're amazing. And I said, well, but I don't like this couch surfing stuff. And they said, yeah, I think it's more than that. Look, but they're just amazing. You should meet with them. And I'm like, all right, fine, I'll meet with them. Like anytime that someone in your network tells you this entrepreneur is amazing, part of investing is there's a lot more smart people out there than you. And so you always want to meet those smart, amazing people. And so it's like, fine, like I'll meet with them. And, I kind of said, I was like, okay, come by my office on Sunday, we'll chat about it. And 2 minutes into the meeting, because of course they didn't pitch it as couch surfing, they pitched it as this is a marketplace for space, and the space goes all the way from a couch, to castles, right? And it's the whole thing. And I went, oh, well, that's totally different, right? And so 2 minutes in, I literally paused them because I'd already had network intelligence on the founders, which is always a great thing to do. I paused them and said, look, I'm going to make you an offer to invest. It's already guaranteed. I'm going to make you an offer to invest. Whether or not we get the right offer and figure it out, let's now turn this into a working session because because I understand marketplaces and I understand, like dynamics and this stuff. And let's kind of work through that because that'll give me a better sense of how you're thinking of the business. That will mean that we're spending this kind of hour and a half together in ways where I'm being helpful to you and you can see, your decision of me because, financings are kind of these later stage marriages, right? After the kind of the founders, having their marriage. And so like, let's make sure that we want to be in this boat together and that you have to kind of decide on me as well. And so we worked through that. And I was like, look, you've got to be measuring things like this. You got to be looking at this, here's some obvious risks down the road. How are you thinking about them? Et cetera, et cetera. And then I said, come into the partnership tomorrow, right? They said, well, but we haven't updated the presentation. No, come into the partnership tomorrow, present. Now, one of the other funny part of this presentation, which kind of gets the third part, Chris knows where I'm going with this, is that my amazing partner, David Z, who is the Greylock lead in the LinkedIn, who is the reason why I'm at Greylock, kind of looked at this, brought and Airbnb was one of the very first deals that I brought into the partnership, the first one I did, looked at me and said, look, every VC has to have a deal they're going to fail on. Airbnb can be yours. right? Right. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. David is super smart, right? And it's one of the things we learned about being contrarian and right in investing is actually, in fact, what you want is you want some of your smart investors to think that this is a bad idea because that gives you your contrarian test. And then you want to have a theory about you're right. Now, among the things I love about David is that David, 6 months later, there hadn't been any real change. Airbnb was like years like this in the metrics before it kind of hit the hockey stick. It hadn't been any change in the network, any change in the actual results. And David came to me and said, oh, you were totally right about Airbnb. I was wrong. What did you see that I didn't see? And this is actually part of how you get around to investing in general, but also applies to blitzscaling, which you say, look, here are the things that could go wrong. But if you have a plan to navigate them, and if you get around them, it can be huge, right? So of course, regulators could regulate a business. Of course, neighbors of people who are neighbors of Airbnb rentals go, well, we're not really sure that we want a retail traffic flow into our apartment building or something else. Something bad could happen, and things have bad, like, people's apartments have been trashed and so forth. But part of my theory of this is actually, in fact, one, you get to enough scale where people go, oh my God, I understand the demand. And then you get to enough scale where you can mitigate the bads. Like you can mitigate we can actually be a better safety check than you generally get. We can be kind of like actually, in fact, making sure that it's working out reasonably well for the neighbors in ways that, because you have a network and kind of community engagement, then actually, in fact, they knew when they're just the concept of, well, actually, in fact, the apartment next to you is being rented for 3 nights to somebody. Oh, actually, in fact, that's not such a bad thing. And we can actually control that in various ways. And we can cause it. And so all you had to do was get to scale for that. And then once you got to scale for that, you could start building in those features that made all of the rest of the stuff work. And that was part of the active theory of the investment. And so I was like, that's what I saw. Not you were wrong about, well, maybe it'd be regulated out of this. No, of course you were right. But there was a theory of the case, and if it turned out to be right, then it's huge. And that Airbnb has proven.
And that's the key with blitzscaling. Like blitzscaling provides you a way to have an orientation towards massive possibility. And it's not just a wishful thinking kind of orientation. It's a systematic way of saying, is this a company that exists in a space where it's a winner take most market, where if it's successful, it can be an enduring market leader and print money for decades. And the key is it really is systematic. Of course, with venture investing, I tell many people, you could turn down every single deal that comes to you, and you would be right 90 to 95% of the time, and then you would also make $0.
Yes, exactly. Because, by the way, part of like there's frequently, kind of tar brush things on this kind of Silicon Valley approach, which is it's get big fast, it's just spend tons of capital when you don't know your margin structure and so forth. And they go, oh, that's all crazy. And you go, well, actually, it's not necessarily crazy when it's part of a kind of a portfolio approach. And you actually have a systematic way of converting at least one, right? Because usually one is all you need to have a really interesting portfolio of investment. And if you have 2, it's then epic. And so that's the kind of approach to it. And it's that orientation of saying, like, back when the first internet boom happened and then the bust, and Chris and I detailed this a little bit in the book, there was this whole like, oh, Silicon Valley was crazy and we're doing it. And actually, in fact, the word things were crazy. Webvan was crazy. All Advantage was crazy. There was shit that was happening. It was totally crazy because it was like, oh my God, we just got to move fast, get big fast. I was like, no. You want to move fast when it's worth it, right? When you have a good theory about what that mature business might be. Doesn't mean you're 100%. And part of the uncertainty that Chris and I are talking about in blitzscaling is, hey, I don't know what my margin structure is. When I invested in Airbnb, I had no clue what the margin structure would be. Who knew, right? But I went, look, there's a very good likelihood that it will work out in a good way, right? And so, great, because margin structure is part of what creates a valuable business. That's a TBD with some risk factor associated with it. But we will get to that risk factor and we will navigate as we go. And that's what the insight in blitzscaling is. Which things can you say, those things we can prove or work on later, and we can make happen now in order to be the first to scale, or as we call it in the book and the post, is first to scale product market fit.
Exactly. And again, these are all part of the book Blitzscaling, which you can pick up in fine bookstores everywhere. where we talk about market size, distribution, gross margins, network effects, product market fit, and operational and organizational scalability. And these are all the things that you take into account.